Hello everyone, this is Mr. J, and today we're going to take a look at the 5th unit of U.S. history, according to the New York State Regents, which is the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. This is a pretty complex unit that has widespread impacts on America. It's not often covered in a lot of detail in middle school or elementary school, so this video is going to be a little bit of a more in-depth look at some of the circumstances, efforts, and impacts from this time period. Essentially, I'm going to try to go through the Regents standards with some different visuals, make like a visual study guide, and I'll try to do the entire unit until the baby wakes up, in which case I will have to pause this video. The Gilded Age is often thought about as the Industrial Revolution in America, and that's partly true and partly not, because the Industrial Revolution really begins in America before the Civil War. Some of the technologies, even of the late market revolution, we're talking about telegraphs and the start of electricity, those are often associated with industrialization. But the Gilded Age is what America has started to call the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War in the United States, because it doesn't just represent a technological revolution. It doesn't just represent like an economic change in America. As you can sort of see from this image, the Gilded Age is the time of great industrialization, great new technology, great wealth for some, and a lot of urbanization and more struggle efforts by the most of the United States. So we'll take a look at the circumstances of the Gilded Age here for a little while, and then look at some of the major efforts before we break down, in either the next video, the efforts of individuals and groups. So the Gilded Age is the technological revolution. It's the Industrial Revolution. That means there's going to be the telephone. Yep, you are looking at a telephone for communication. The Bessemer process. This is a process of refining raw material into steel. It's a very efficient way to make steel. Steel is used for everything from transportation to infrastructure, buildings, skyscrapers. This is going to build the cities and factories and many of the tools across America. Transportation with the railroad, not your old-fashioned railroad, coal-powered railroads as well. Electricity and the light bulb becoming prevalent around many parts of America, and also things like the automatic reaper or the mechanical reaper, not just people farming by traditional means. You also have technology in the Gilded Age, such as the streetcar, that it revolutionizes before the automobile how Americans move around in cities. You also have refrigeration. Fun fact, nothing was refrigerated in the United States of America until the Gilded Age, when refrigeration became a standard process. This allows for like a revolution in nutrition changes. Meat becomes widely available because it can be transported cold. Dairy and many other goods get to be moved around the country, not just consumed locally. And music. The phonograph is invented during the Gilded Age. You could not listen to music unless it was live until the late 1800s. So there's also a lot of circumstances involving the political circumstances of the Gilded Age, because how do these different companies and corporations make so much money? There's a series of Supreme Court and federal actions that really enable and boost the ability of different companies, corporations, trusts, and monopolies. The Wabash Railroad case from 1886 is a major one, because this places the hands of interstate commerce in the hands of Congress, which we sort of know from the Gibbons-Ogden case. But this also puts pressure on Congress to act if the states can't regulate things like the railroads or now like the internet. And also shortly after this, the Congress is going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act. But in a lot of ways, who is going to be in charge of regulating these massive companies that emerged during the Gilded Age? It is supposed to be the federal government, not the state government, not your local government. So the next year, when Congress passes the Interstate Commerce Act, this is a way to have the Congress oversee, or well, I guess really an Interstate Commerce Commission created by Congress and the federal government to oversee the railroads, to oversee the growth of the railroads and the many impacts that it has on people across the country. But according to this political cartoon and many others, Congress is very corrupt. At the time of the Gilded Age, people do not elect their own senators. I repeat, at the time of the Gilded Age, the people do not directly elect their own senators. The Senate, as depicted in this political cartoon, is full of, what do you want to call it, corrupt politicians that have been put in place in Congress via lobbying and other political efforts by the trusts and the monopolies and the major companies, so that the representatives in Congress, specifically in the Senate, do not represent the American people. They represent the big businesses. So if Congress is now in charge of regulating interstate commerce, but one half of the Congress, the Senate, is sort of paid for or sponsored by these large monopolies and trusts, you can sort of tell who is running the country. And this is why we do not talk about most of the Gilded Age presidents. We don't talk about a lot of the even a lot of the elections in the political realm for the Gilded Age, because as one correspondent once said, from the Standard Oil Company to the J.P. Morgan Bank, it doesn't matter who controls the country during this time period politically. It doesn't matter who's the president, because the people who really control the country are the businesses. And the business leaders of the country during the Gilded Age are these captains of industry: Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford later on, Andrew Carnegie early on. These business owners control massive, gigantic monopolies. For example, with like the railroad, Vanderbilt will buy up many of the different railroads around the country. Carnegie will be almost the exclusive producer of steel. Rockefeller will essentially monopolize the oil industry. We're talking about if there was only one cell phone company in the United States of America and you had to buy your cell phone from them. We're talking about if there was only one car company in America and you had to buy your car from them. This gives a great deal of power and, of course, profit to these industries. And to their credit, many of these captains of industries also invested in colleges, universities, and different philanthropic efforts to give back to the community. So oftentimes these captains of industry, who are the most influential individuals in America during the Gilded Age and the richest, they do give back to their communities. But how are they making all that money? Oh, well, according to this political cartoon, as you can see, many of these political leaders, many of these economic leaders who also are really politically in control of the country, they have made their millions off of the backbreaking labor of laborers, right? People who are only getting paid $6 a week. Yes, of course, that's more money nowadays than it was in the past, but it was not a lot of money then, nor would the equivalent be much for today. As depicted in this cartoon, this is the other representation of these captains of industry as robber barons, people who make their money maybe legitimately, but through dastardly means, through oppression of their workers and unfair pay for their workers. In a lot of ways, this is a correlation that many people see between the Gilded Age and America today, where the 1%, or even the 1% of the 1%, control the greatest amount of wealth in the country. And there's a larger, lower working class, a poorer class, and fewer middle class. So it's up to you to decide if these corporations, these monopolies, and their leaders were for the good or for the detriment of the country. You can make arguments and claims that some of these individuals were both captains of industry and robber barons. But on the whole, it's basically true that many of these different companies engaged in practices that both brought great productivity and profit to America, but not necessarily to all the people living in America. That's why there's going to be many major efforts by labor unions to organize, to have the right to represent laborers throughout this time period. And that's why we'll take a look at some of the efforts by, like, for example, the Knights of Labor, the American Railroad Union, and the AFL-CIO, and so on. You're also going to see that the union effort extends to women in the workforce, such as the Ladies' Garments, International Ladies' Garment Women's Union. And there's also going to be efforts by farmers, such as the populist and Grange movements. There's going to be speeches by Williams Jennings Bryan to remove the country from the gold standard, to really stop the economic oppression of especially the poor farmers who are bringing different materials to market and foods to market, but not getting paid as they had in the past. Williams Jennings Bryan's going to run for president, for example. And we'll not talk about this a lot because this is New York, right? If you were in Iowa and Wyoming, and you were in Oklahoma, and you were in Arkansas, you would learn a lot more about the populist and Grange movement. But it's one item on the New York State Regents. We're also going to look at how this is a worldwide effort. Not only are laborers and workers in the United States organizing for the right to work, but internationally, workers are uniting and organizing. And yes, this is leading to socialism and communism in other countries, and efforts for socialism and communism in the United States of America, too. So who are these workers? Who are these people who are building the country that work for Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan, and so on? Well, before we talk about who these people are, we want to talk about the circumstances that they face. And this is where you get to hear the age-old story, which is true, that racism is not a new thing in any country, let alone in America. This is a flag from the 1840s, from the Know Nothing Party, where it warns Native Americans, not what we call Native Americans, but what they called themselves at the times, to beware of foreign influence. This is a rallying cry early on in the U.S., even before the Civil War, to keep immigrants out of America, to keep the status quo population in control of the country, and to exclude groups from other countries, other races, other religions, and different backgrounds. There's going to be some racist material here, obviously. This is going to go on into the Gilded Age and even into the Progressive Era, where there's going to be racism against different immigrant groups that come to the United States of America, Asian Americans in the West, because there is a great boom in population growth brought about by larger immigration during the Gilded Age. Immigration had been growing throughout the United States. It took a slight dip during the Civil War, of course, but immigration had been booming in America since the Jeffersonian age, and it really came to a head in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. These are millions of Americans who come, there are millions of Americans who come to America. They gain their citizenship. Their children and their grandchildren will be legal U.S. citizens, and this is going to change the demographics of the entire country. This is especially true in New York, where during the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age, many immigrant groups that are coming to the United States aren't the same British groups that used to dominate. The earliest wave of immigrants of the Gilded Age are often Irish, German, and also, of course, from other countries like Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. But as you can see later on in the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age, by the time of the 1900s, there's not as many immigrants coming from England or even Ireland as had been in the in the second half of the 1800s. There's many more people coming from Russia. There's going to be political upheaval that moves people from Austria and Hungary, and so on. So there's a changing dynamic in who is coming to the country. And these are the laborers that are working in the factories, in the cities, on the farms, and so on. This is especially true for New York City, where Ellis Island is a major immigration station. This is a major influx of people to the United States, to the New York area. Some of them stay in New York. Some of them move on to places like Buffalo or places like Texas, or people don't necessarily stay in New York City, but millions of Americans come to New York. Many of them stay in the New York area. And this is why there's a major effort to really keep track and to document immigrants when they come to the United States of America. They're checked for diseases such as trachoma. They're checked briefly for criminal history and other things. But most of the immigrants who come to places like Ellis Island are let into the country. This is also true on the West Coast, where Pacific where Asian Americans are immigrating from China, Japan, and Korea and India to a lesser extent during this time period. Um, and this effort of immigration out west is met also with blatant racism and opposition to immigrants and the economic impact of them taking jobs and making and setting up businesses alongside traditional American businesses. Right? You can tell I'm not going to try to get political here in this unit, but I will tell you. I don't know. I'll say that for another day. Um, this kind of racism is not only extended to Asian Americans. You can imagine there's going to be a racist animosity towards new groups coming to Ellis Island in New York City, to other places like Chicago and around the country. But it is the Chinese Americans who are excluded first. These are the first group of people who not only have violence, but also have political action aimed at limiting the immigration of Chinese Americans to the country. This is why you saw on the map earlier, there is this peak of, there's this early peak of immigration. There is then starting to put limitations and immigration restrictions on certain countries. And then again, especially during the 1900s, 1910s, there's going to be very strict regulation on immigration. There's also going to be the First and then Second World Wars. And immigration won't really return to the level of the Gilded Age until like the 1980s, which is amazing if you think about how recent the 80s were and how many more millions of people were living around the world then versus in, for example, like the 1900s, early 1900s, when many immigrants were still coming to the United States. So it's a major impact on the country and many, many, many different efforts to be made for each of these different groups. But where do these immigrants live? Well, when they come to New York City, they're going to live in tenements. They're going to live in ramshackle, hastily made, unsafe, unsanitary living conditions. These tenements are called dens of death. This is the name of this image, taken by Jacob Riis, who we'll look at here in a minute. And these immigrant communities, whether they be from the Jewish community or from the Italian American community, I think this one is Italian American holding a baby in a courtyard. People are living in these shacks. Okay, people are living out in very squalid conditions all around New York City. Young women, men. This one's called 5 cents a spot. You can see that people are really crammed together in living conditions that go beyond inhumane. This one's called I believe it's called the slide at the playground where the children used to play, right? There's not public facilities. There is not even schooling for many of these different children. They're either waiting to get into the workforce or just trying to bide the time throughout the day. During the second half of the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, there's also the First Great Migration. This is connected to Reconstruction, where finally, in like the 1910s and 20s, many African Americans will finally leave the South, headed to places like Detroit, out west to an extent as well, and generally from rural communities to cities. So even though many African Americans might be moving from Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia to Atlanta or Montgomery, some of them will also move to Boston, to New York, to Buffalo, and so on. And this will continue throughout the 1900s, throughout the 20th century as well, with the Second Great Migration. As you can tell, the African American community is going to be leaving the South with a lot of their culture. This is where blues and rock and roll and then eventually rap music come from, all you kids at home with the drill music. And they're going to also be facing segregation and economic opportunity at the same time throughout the United States in places like New York City, for example. Okay, quick water break. So you have these two sides. You have millions and millions of Americans, Americans living in America, immigrants, African Americans migrating throughout America, and you have these huge corporations controlled by the robber barons or captains of industry. And this leads to many labor and business disputes that change America throughout the Gilded Age. We will not look at all of these, but there's some that you need to know And the first one is the Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot, or demonstration, if you want to pick sides, was an effort by many Chicago-based immigrants and citizens to expand their rights. What did these people want? They wanted an 8-hour workday, right? If you complain about being in school for 8 hours, you want to know most people would have gone crazy for the chance to only have an 8-hour workday. Children were not even granted the right to go to school in most places at this time period. They were working backbreaking labor for 10, 12 hours a day. So one of the major goals of the Haymarket movement and the labor movement is limiting the workday and getting overtime pay for anything outside of a standard workday. At the Haymarket, which is a major, basically like the Times Square of Chicago, there are speeches by different labor leaders. And at the end of one of the speeches, a bomb is thrown into the crowd of advancing police officers. The police officers fire on the demonstrators. They arrest leaders. They arrest hundreds of rioters or demonstrators, if you will. And there is a great big, what do you want to call it, ripple effect throughout the country, because there are many other labor movements and workers groups throughout the country that were also organizing for better pay, fewer hours. There were clashes with private police forces and public police forces, National Guard around the country. But the Haymarket is a watershed moment because after the violence of the Haymarket riot itself, there are going to be widespread protests, sabotage, demonstrations around the country, and the leaders of the Haymarket riot are going to be arrested, put on trial for murder of the police officers and terrorism, and several of the leaders of the Haymarket riot will be executed. So this will show you how in the early Gilded Age, it was very difficult or impossible for workers to have peaceful protest unmolested by police. It was very difficult for workers to advance their agenda without violence or being answered by violence. And it was in many places illegal, or basically you would be shunned or blacklisted to become part of a union or to support a labor union. This continues around the United States with different strikes and different movements. But another pivotal one is the Pullman strike. This is a train car strike that affects the United States of America. The long story short is that Pullman is one of these captains of industry. He has created a train car, right? Part of a train that is used for refrigeration. He also has passenger train cars that are used to transport people around the country, nationwide, right? DC, Maryland, Boston, Los Angeles, and anywhere that there are trains. Pullman buys up a great deal of land in the Chicago area, and he names his town Pullman. The reason that he has this town is so that the workers at his train car plant can live close to the factory, report to work, go back home. But Pullman owns not just the factory, but the town. Pullman owns the schools in the town. Pullman owns the businesses in the town. So you never want to be in this situation where your boss is also your landlord, because what happens when there is a panic and Pullman decides to lower wages while also raising the prices, is that there becomes great pressure on his workers, who are essentially trapped working for a boss who's paying them less and charging them more money for regular means. This results in a strike. This results in a huge effort by the Pullman car workers, first in Chicago, to go on strike, to stop working, and then to organize a strike around the country. There is violence as saboteurs and other radicals block train tracks, light cars on fire. Again, there's going to be a very large correlation in the early Gilded Age between efforts for unions and laborers and violence by unions and laborers, and efforts against the laborers with violence as well. Around the country, the rail transport comes to a screeching halt. I want you to imagine that, for example, Amazon went on strike for a few months. Okay, well, this strike didn't last for a few months, but why don't you imagine that Amazon went on strike? Nobody are getting any kind of packages anywhere around the country from Amazon. I want you to imagine that all of the courier services, all the Uber Eats or whatever transportation services went on strike. This is the reason why the country is really so crippled and polarized by the Pullman strike. And eventually, the president of the United States calls in military and National Guard officials to end the strike and to force the laborers back to work. The leader of the American Railway Union, who was the head of the Pullman strike, goes on trial, and this decision goes all the way to the federal government, where it is upheld that the federal government can halt a strike, or that the government can force workers back to work if it stops the public interest or it hurts the public interest, in this case, delivering the mail. These injunctions, this government action that can force people back to work becomes a powerful weapon against strikers and unionists. You can ask people in the airline industry today, can you go on strike? We'll see what they say. But this sets a precedent for limiting strikes and protests if they, quote unquote, hurt the public interest. And finally, not one of the most famous, but I think one of the biggest watershed and the last of the three labor demonstrations that we'll look at in detail in this unit is the Ludlow Massacre. Ludlow is a small coal mining town operated by the Rockefeller family in Colorado. As you can see from this image, the working conditions of the men and women and children who are working on these coal mines is outrageously demeaning. And when you couple it with that, like this is money going to like the second and like third richest person in America, you can see how this is primed for some constitutional civic controversy. Ludlow is again another example of this town that has been created to serve the captains of industry, to promote economic growth. These are families that have been moved out to or have volunteered to move out to Ludlow, Colorado, but they want better pay. They want higher wages. They don't necessarily want child workers. Child workers take jobs away from adult workers. Child workers also obviously really harm the long-term growth of these communities that they come from. And so the Ludlow coal miners go on strike. They strike, they refuse to allow workers access to the mines, and they formed this tent colony in 1914 outside of Ludlow, Colorado, when, again, the military and private security forces are brought in to break the strike, to continue the coal mining process, and they massacre part of the tent colony. They basically set fire to the community. They fire on anybody trying to escape the community. And this is not what you want in your papers. You do not want, if you are Rockefeller and his sons and his family, to be known as this millionaire, billionaire who is killing women and children so that you can have a little bit more money in your pocket, right? This is why the Gilded Age starts to shift from this this situation of the robber barons or the captains of industries controlling the country, to a major effort by individuals to improve the situation and the way of life for most Americans, not just for the corporations and their owners. So the Ludlow Massacre is also a major moment where there's going to be now criticism, unlike the Haymarket riot, against the larger companies, more support for workers and unions around the country. And that's a large way why the Gilded Age will become the progressive era, and there will be many efforts made to examine problems and attempts for unionization and reform around the country. Okay. The baby's still asleep, so I'm just going to go straight into the next video. Whew. Okay. Should have got more water. So some of the efforts and impacts of the progressive era, we just looked at, for example, the the major immigration factor, the circumstances in the cities, the circumstances between the captains of industry and the monopolies and their workers. So we're going to take a look here at the efforts and impacts of individuals specifically to transform this Gilded Age where the companies and monopolies dominate America to the progressive era, which doesn't look as nice, of course, but remember, this is not a real thing. And this is a real people. So the progressive era is going to be an effort for society to reform or to improve, for there to be laws passed so that children do not lose their feet in order to make your jeans, so that people don't get their fingers chopped off, so that you can have a sausage, so that people don't need to expose their children to chemicals and work multiple hours a day, and that women can get the right to vote, right? This is not as exotic as the richest people in America. But, most people aren't the richest people in America. So they also, care. And what are some of these efforts? Well, as you can tell from the New York State standards, there are different efforts by many individuals. I've often not joked, but talked about with different colleagues at different schools. You could spend an entire semester on this. You could really break down Jane Addams and the Hull House effort in Chicago for a week. Spend a week on Jacob Riis and how the other half lives in the Italian Jewish communities in New York City. You could spend, but this is one part of the New York State standards. So we're going to try to get an overview of some of these different individual efforts. What I always tell people is this: if you are in class and you hear your teacher mention one of these people and you think this is interesting, that is probably a calling or a message that this is something that you want to get involved in your life or you want to learn more about so that you can find your calling or passion in life. Because if one of these stories resonates with you, you have probably found something that you might want to work on or volunteer your time on and take individual action towards. There's a lot in this unit. So we're going to do a quick overview. We looked at photographs by Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was an immigrant to New York City. He was a photographer alongside many of the police forces, and he took photographs of the tenements and different poor areas of New York City to bring awareness to how the other half lives, how many Americans are living in terrible poverty, even when America is profiting as a whole, and major companies are making more money than ever during the Gilded Age. At the same time, Jane Addams is another city reformer based out of Chicago. She does a lot of different efforts through her Hull House program, trying to have better tenements and housing, schools for children, right? Do not send them to the coal mines. And also public advocacy works, sponsoring lawyers and representation for men, women, immigrants, migrants, and their families in the Chicago area and in other cities, right? What one person does, like Jacob Riis's photography in New York City, someone's going to see that in San Francisco and be like, yes, people will want to see these photographs. They're going to want to do the same with tenement reform in cities like Atlanta, Miami, and so on. Margaret Sanger is another individual. She will really champion the birth control effort, an effort to allow women the right to control their bodies and to regulate the cycle of their periods, to allow themselves to take medicine or other partners to have contraception to prevent unwanted childbirth. And another individual effort of this time period is Ida Wells. Ida Wells is a writer who brings awareness to the lynching and political violence and racist violence against African Americans throughout the country. Right? If I was in control of New York State, you'd be learning about these two individuals for like a week and a half each. But hey, we got to keep moving because there's dozens of people. Booker T. Washington establishes different work programs to advance and train African Americans around the country, like the Tuskegee Institute. And W.E.B. Du Bois has a major effort to improve education for African Americans and also legal representation through the NAACP. Can't talk enough about the NAACP. This major political group will be a huge component of the civil rights movement. It's something that gets started during the progressive era, but you're starting to see these different individuals are fighting for not only their groups and their beliefs, but beliefs that will move many people's lives forwards. Teddy Roosevelt is one of the few political leaders that we'll see featured individually here. He starts as a police officer, and he runs the Tenement Reform Commission in New York City, trying to reform, trying to reduce crime in New York City by improving the living conditions of the people in the city. And Ida Tarbell, who writes a scathing portrayal and illustrations about the Standard Oil Company, really trying to stick it to the Standard Oil Company and other monopolists around the country. And Upton Sinclair. Enough can't be made about Upton Sinclair because he's one of these muckrakers. He's one of these journalists or influencers who is trying to push reform around the country by drawing attention to the horrendous living, working, social conditions that people are facing. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which we will read a little bit in class of, and is the other book outside of Uncle Tom's Cabin that I would fight for every 11th grader to have to read over the course of U.S. history, is a book about, and hope you're not eating, people who work in the meat industry. These are people who go to work with no hazardous gear, who are working for 10, 12, 15 hours a day. These are people whose fingers get cut off and they fall into your sausage. These are people who get infections in their leg and then have to have it amputated. These are workers who are providing this new burgeoning meat industry with the materials that Americans are demanding, but they aren't protected and the meat stinks. Ironically, Upton Sinclair wants improvements in the meatpacking industry to benefit the workers. He wants them to be paid better. He wants them to have fewer hours a week. But people are so disgusted by what they read in this book about the conditions of their meat. I don't want to eat some guy's fingers or some diseased filet mignon. So that they have to be so that there starts to be a push to reform the meatpacking industry. And then many other industries, right? If people don't want to eat tainted meat, they're not going to want gross vegetables. If people are worried about the sanitary conditions in the factories that produce food, they're also going to worry about medicine. They're also going to start to push for reform in other areas. And this is how progress happens. It might start in one area, but then expand into the lives and communities of others. So this is how individual action is very, very powerful, especially in the progressive era, especially potentially today, where these individuals take a stand, make extraordinary efforts for what they believe in, and to benefit the communities and people that they care about, and therefore reform the country or the world. There's also going to be a pushback. The Muckrakers are going to have exposés on basically lies and deception in cosmetics, in medicine, illegal or should be illegal drugs, outrageous claims by businesses and manufacturers. The FDA will be created. The Food and Drug Administration will be created as one of these, as one of the impacts of the Muckrakers. Not only is now President Theodore Roosevelt going to create the Pure Food and Drug Act in order to lead the way against companies that have deceptive advertising practices and unsafe, unsanitary, unhygienic working conditions. But they're also going to regulate medicine around the country as well. There's also going to be an effort to end child labor. Child laborers have been a part of history, U.S. and otherwise, since the beginning of time, but there's going to be a major push as the Gilded Age becomes the progressive age to get these children out of the factories and the coal mines and into school. Well, you could always ask yourself, would I rather be breathing coal in a dark mine that could collapse around me any moment for a few pennies a day? Or would I rather be in school listening to this lecture? You decide. But this is why, right, like older generations often say, you don't want to be in school, but school is your job. If you wanted to have another job, this is the job that you would probably have. It doesn't look so fun, does it? The child labor laws are going to be passed statewide at first, and then there's going to be national efforts for federal laws. There's going to be laws and efforts to limit the workday for children. Yes, finally, workers will have an 8-hour day if they're 14 or 15 years old. No more than 44 hours per week. There's also going to be pushes, and this is like, for example, the modern Alabama um, um, labor laws for children, right? No one under 14 can be employed legally in the state of Alabama. And you're going to see this effort in states across the country, and then a federal or nationwide push. There's going to be a push for children all around the country to be in school, not working on the farm or in the factory, to better themselves for the long term and not just have a short term gig that gets them some money, but not a career in stability. So there's going to be the Fair Labor Standards Act. There's going to be an administration to make sure that children are going to school. There is going to be regulation in the 1910s to punish companies that employ child laborers, right? Like, oh no, it was fine for us to employ child laborers, but if you're going to attack my business for employing child labor, I will not employ child labor anymore, right? Your company will get in trouble if your mines have children under 16, or if your factory has children under 14, right? If they're not in school and they're working, your company or business can also have their sales banned. These are major efforts to limit the corporations and benefit children of all groups and communities nationwide. But the companies still have a lot of power. And this is a political cartoon about the Pacific Railroad Company, which has bought up shipping industries, stagecoach industries. They have freight that controls the farm, and they have also grasped control of communications, publications, and, of course, the government as well. And so there's going to be a major push. There's going to be a major push in the late Gilded Age and Progressive era to limit the power of these monopolies, of these large groups. The real key is one company should not control an entire industry, or it will result in unfair business practices, oppression of its workers, and generally things that most people wouldn't want to deal with themselves individually. So you probably shouldn't do it to somebody else. But we looked a little bit at the labor demonstrations in the first part of this video. In addition, hang on, now my slides don't want to work here. In addition, there's going to be also legislation passed to limit the trusts or to limit the monopolies, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is an early and flimsier way to take down monopolies or make sure other companies can compete with these monopolies. These are attempts to restrict the monopolies, but it's going to take larger efforts such as the Clayton Antitrust Act to really strengthen the federal government's ability to break up these trusts, to give labor unions more power to strike, boycott, organize for their workers. And this is why there's a huge shift from the Gilded Age to the Progressive era, because the circumstances are not just in favor of the corporations anymore. There are also being federal actions, Supreme Court cases as well, that are limiting what companies can look like and what companies can do, while they also enable what workers and unions are allowed to do. And what about the corruption in the Senate? Well, as you sort of could maybe guess, because this is what we have today, if the Senate is corrupt because individuals are not electing their senators, how about you have an amendment that lets people elect their senators? So yes, until the 17th Amendment, you gotta have to know this one too, until the 17th Amendment in 1913, you did not vote for your senators. The state legislature, the Congress, if you will, of New York or New Jersey or Connecticut, those state legislatures, which is largely the rich and the powerful of each state, used to just pick and elect the senators. That's why many of the senators were really loyal to the trusts and monopolies and companies, not to the citizens, because the citizens weren't voting for them. But in 1913, this changed. The 17th Amendment allows for direct election of senators. That means you and me and everybody in our state go and vote for the senators. If we don't like them, we get to change them in every 6 years or so. And that really reduces the corruption in the Senate because the senators have to answer to the people, not the purse. And finally, and can't be understated enough, so this is going to be a longer segment, the women's right to vote. Women organized throughout the Gilded Age, throughout Reconstruction, even before the Civil War, to gain the right to vote. But it all finally came to a head at the end of the Progressive Era in the 1910s, where women were finally granted in 1920 the right to vote nationwide. This is a long story, and it's also correct to try to think about this story as like an enduring issue or a long-term effort by several different individuals and groups throughout the United States. Right, suffrage or the right to vote is not just something that happens one day. You don't just wake up one day and suddenly have these abilities or powers or rights or reforms. There has to be a longer, enduring effort in order to get there. So, for the right to vote or political enfranchisement or suffrage, women had been advocating for many issues throughout the United States during the 1800s. Women were involved in the abolition movement, the temperance movement, but women were still denied the right to vote. And many women around the world could not vote in the early 1800s either. This is like the circumstances before the Gilded Age, just to say. Again, even before the Gilded Age started, there were efforts by early feminists, such as the First Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, where the Declaration of Sentiments was adopted, where there really became like an organized effort to have women enfranchised and enabled nationwide. And this also has to do with the impact of the Reconstruction Amendments, because when the 14th Amendment was passed, it stated that the states should not restrict the rights of citizens. And women were citizens. So how come they can't vote? Okay, right? Like, isn't that a restriction to limit women's right to vote? If women are citizens of the United States, they can, and this is why also when the 15th Amendment was in discussion, there was a great deal of consternation and even debate about what should be the priority. Should women get the right to vote before African American men? Should African American men get the right to vote before women? And obviously the answer is everybody who is a citizen of a country should be able to vote. But this was an issue that needed to be dealt with during Reconstruction and into the Gilded Age. So again, really like the circumstances before the Gilded Age. Once the 15th Amendment is extending or supposed to extend the right to vote to African American males, there also becomes an organized effort to gain women the right to vote too, because still half the country can't vote. Not enough can be said about Susan B. Anthony's individual efforts to gain the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony risked her own life. She risked her prosperity. She organized hundreds and thousands of meetings, conventions, publications nationwide. She really fought for the 19th Amendment in a way that can't be equaled. It's not a competition either. And so this is also why often times the Women's Right to Vote Amendment, the 19th Amendment, is sometimes called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Because with the extension of the right to vote for the 15th Amendment in 1870, women began to organize throughout the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for their right to vote too. You can see that nationwide, women could vote even in the earlier Gilded Age in places like Wyoming and in Utah. This is even during Reconstruction. Women could vote in some of these states, but they weren't able to vote in the East and in the South and in large parts of the Midwest. Even many of these states, right, like 1918, 1912, it's not until the Progressive Era is really moving along that women are given suffrage rights in some of these states. But the situation is essentially that while some states have taken the action of enfranchising women and giving them the right to vote, other states have not. And some states simply have no women can vote in places like Florida, Pennsylvania, New Jersey in the year 1919. Women can vote in some elections in places like Texas, Tennessee, Ohio. And they can vote across the board in these states with the numbers. So this is really an effort that starts out west for women to gain the right to vote locally and in their state, and that then expands into a nationwide effort to expand the women's right to vote. However, many of the leaders from the early feminist movement have passed away by the time that the Gilded Age is really turning into the progressive era, the turn of the century, the 1900s. This is why there needs to be a second generation or a new wave of women's rights feminists. Many women were becoming better educated, working, becoming more independent in the 1910s and 1920s. And that's why this next generation of suffragists, such as like Carrie Catt or Alice Paul, are going to organize the new wave of feminism in the end of the progressive era. They have different efforts, right? So, for example, Carrie Chapman Catt really believes that state by state women should organize for the right to vote. She also doesn't want to like flout or disrupt different gender norms. Doesn't want to cause embarrassment for the movement. Other people like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, they lead the National Women's Party, and they don't care what people think a lady should act like. They really adopt different strategies from the UK, where the women's right to vote has also been undergoing a great reform effort, and these women want to really like picket the White House and have more aggressive strategies to campaign for the women's rights to vote. And it's safe to say that without these two efforts, without both of these efforts, women would probably not have been extended the right to vote in 1920. There can't be enough said about these efforts, but we're going to go through them shortly because I think I hear the baby in the other room. And because the Regents gave a full civic essay on this in June 2023 that we can look at and break down to see also like officially what does New York State expect for us to learn about the women's rights movement. But enough can't be said about these women and men who fought for the women's right to vote. So some of their efforts, in addition to organizing a party, they also used picketing demonstrations in front of the White House, blocking businesses and especially blocking public offices. And this meant a major widespread effort against the president, against the current president, Woodrow Wilson. And these are public efforts that were like, I thought Woodrow Wilson did support the women's right to vote. Yeah, he did, because he was getting bad press and he was getting slammed by the suffragette movement. So Wilson decided, I want to be president again. Maybe I should give women the right to vote, and maybe I should change my tune and support women's suffrage. Yeah, good idea, Wilson. The right to vote is a worldwide effort. The right to vote is not just an effort that happens in America. Many of these suffragettes and suffrage leaders, they organize, they campaign, they get put on trial, they petition. They are out in the streets trying to get votes and signatures. They are publishing newspapers. They are getting their children to help organize their efforts, getting the schools to help push for women's rights to vote. This is a well-organized effort that's going to really lay a lot of the framework for civil rights leaders in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They're going to have legal protests. They are going to really try to push the boundary of what is a legal protest and what is an illegal protest. They're willing to not only give speeches, but to be arrested, to demonstrate, to have parades, to have large marches and demonstrations. You notice this is not America. Yeah, but it is going to be a worldwide phenomenon that America also takes part in. Fun fact, it's not always about the U.S. and U.S. history. And that's why, for example, this women's right to vote effort takes place in places like Scotland, around the world, and that this idea of Susan B. Anthony's courage calling for a wider effort for women to gain the right to vote nationwide and worldwide is something that everybody, I think, can support and understand. The 19th Amendment is finally ratified in 1920, and women are finally able to vote nationwide, unless, of course, we're talking about Jim Crow segregation and restrictive voting practices against women of color in the South. But we'll leave that for another lesson. That's another unit. So this video really hopefully brought you through both the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And hopefully some of these images and ideas will stand out in your mind, not just for the Regents exam, but how they can maybe serve as inspiration or frame of reference for our own lives as well today. So tell me what questions you had from the video. I will try to segment this into different parts and places, and I'll see you in class.